Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon from wherever you are joining. Please tell us who you are and where you are joining us from by introducing yourself in the chat. My name is Dr. Aditi Mukherjee, and I lead the CGIAR's Climate Impact Platform. And today I'm joining you all from Nairobi this evening. So CGIAR, for those of you who do not know, we are the world's largest publicly funded research and development organization that works on all aspects of climate change and agriculture and food systems, including how food systems cause climate change and how it gets affected by climate change. Through the Climate Impact Platform webinar series that we have recently launched, we invite the world's best-known experts to talk about areas of work where the CGIAR wants to expand its research portfolio. Therefore, I am absolutely delighted to welcome you all to our third webinar of this series. This month, we will be discussing carbon credits and more specifically how carbon credits can or cannot work to benefit smallholder farmers with whom the CGIAR works. This topic choice was also prompted by two excellent commentaries authored by our guests today, who I will introduce now before we delve into the subject. Our first speaker is Professor Rohini Pandey, who is the Henry J. Hines Professor of Economics and the Director of the Economic Growth Center at Yale University. She is also the co-chair of the Political Economy and Government Group at Jameel Poverty Action Lab and a board member of the Bureau of Research on Economic Development. Before Yale, Professor Pandey was at the Harvard Kennedy School, where she co-founded the Evidence for Policy Design. Her article from earlier this year in Science, which she will talk about, and which my colleague Susie will now share in the chat, is a good entry point to understand forest carbon credits. In this paper, she details the underpinning logic of forest carbon credits and goes on to explain why this isn't working. So today we will hear from her on what we can do to implement and actually help prevent climate breakdown and influence and improve the welfare of forest communities. At the same time, I also am very delighted that we will be joined by Dr. Danny Collingwood. He is a climate economist and a lawyer focused on the design and implementation of scientifically grounded climate policy. He's a senior fellow with the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy at the University of Pennsylvania, a research fellow with the Institute of Responsible Carbon Removal at American University, and the vice chair of California's Independent Emissions Advisory Committee. Market Advisory Committee, apologies. He's also one of the authors with David G. Victor of Making Climate Policy Work, a book about political economy of carbon markets. So the work that Dr. Collingwood would talk about is a commentary he published in One Earth earlier this year that makes the case that carbon offsets are incompatible with the Paris Agreement. We will hear why and how in the next hour. So this is our agenda for today. We will first hear from Dr. Collingwood, then have time for some audience interaction via Slido before Professor Pandey will take the virtual podium. As always, we will close with a 15-minute Q&A, so please keep your questions coming. And thank you very much. We are very excited to hear from our expert speakers today and also from you. So please put your questions in the Q&A and introduce yourself in the chat. However, before I hand over to Dr. Collingwood, we have two questions on Slido for you. These questions will remain open during the entire duration of the webinar, and we will share the results at the end. So keep answering these questions as you listen to these presentations. Our first question is, and you can either scan the QR code or join Slido at slido.com, and the code is 2068835. So our first question is, do you work on carbon credits, carbon offsets, or closely related topics? So we already see we have a lot of our audience is a very informed audience and they work on this topic. And this will remain open, so keep answering as we move on to our next question, which is, In your opinion, are carbon credits and offsets benefiting smallholder producers in adopting low emission agricultural practices? This is somehow the focus of the CGIAR going forward. How can we move on to a low emission pathway without compromising food security for our smallholder producers? So again, keep answering, and with that, and we will come to these results towards the end. So with that, I hand over to Dr. Collingwood. You will have roughly 15 minutes to present. And thank you so much for joining us today. And it's an honor and a pleasure to have you. Over to you, Dr. Collingwood.
The honor and the pleasure is mine. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. My name's Danny Cullenward. I'm a climate economist and lawyer who works a lot on carbon markets. And I will present a presentation here about some work that I recently published in One Earth with two colleagues, Grayson Badgley and Freya Che. So before I begin, I want to make three quick disclosures for this group. I currently consult for the United Nations Framework Convention Article 6 negotiations as a member of what's called the Methodological Expert Panel. I also consult for a private carbon credit registry called Isometric that focuses on carbon dioxide removal. And as mentioned in the introduction, I'm the vice chair of California's Carbon Market Advisory Committee. And I want to clarify that my presentation today is in my individual capacity and that I don't represent these groups in this presentation. So I wanted to start with a little context about carbon credits and carbon offsets because I think a lot of the conversation begins with really big numbers and really big scale and the promise of large intervention and large change. And I come from the energy mitigation side of the climate problem, and I'm showing here a figure from the International Energy Agency, which clocks global investment in energy and then tries to distinguish between traditional investments in fossil fuels, which are shown in the darker blue color, and investments in renewable and clean energy, which are shown in the lighter blue color. And what's been interesting is investment in both of those categories has each been around $1 trillion per year for the last several years. And over the last couple of years in particular, investments in clean energy have grown to almost $1.7, $1.8 trillion per year, while fossil fuel investments have more or less stayed put, which again is not consistent with the direction we're trying to travel. And the reason I like to bring this up is because for all of the discussion around carbon credits, which I think have played an outsized role in the strategic orientation of many organizations who are trying to figure out their role on climate strategy, the actual financial flows are minuscule compared to major financial flows in the global investment system. Carbon credits peaked at around $2 billion in 2022. There's a standard industry report from a group called Ecosystems Marketplace, which is due to release an update with its 2023 data in about a week or so. I would expect those numbers to be roughly the same, possibly a little bit lower for 2023. The point is you're talking about a global program that has some 30 years of effort, and the voluntary markets are about $2 billion, which is really a drop in the bucket when you compare it to the major investment flows you see around the world in major systems that need to be decarbonized. So the challenge I want to start with when I introduce the concerns and issues that I want to address is, what would it take to build a multi-billion-dollar market off of the question, what would you have done if I didn't pay you? That is essentially the question that a carbon offset program asks of the project proponents to tell a story about what they would have done if they didn't receive compensation. And that's a very difficult question to answer and answer well, because no third party can verify the answer. That counterfactual scenario never actually happens, and therefore it can't be observed. The person answering that question, the project proponent seeking to earn credit for a climate beneficial activity, has an incentive to exaggerate the outcomes. They earn more credits the more pessimistic their baseline scenario, and however honest they might be, they have an incentive to tell the most aggressive story that is allowed by the rules. And as to the rules themselves, whether those are run by private systems or by government actors, for that rule setting body to assess the validity of the answer that's been given to this question, that person needs to know pretty much everything about the industry and the geography in which that industry is operating. And that means you might be asking an organization to become the world's expert in, for example, rice management practices in Southeast Asia. At the same time, they're an expert in sub-Saharan tropical forests and potentially mechanical carbon dioxide removal techniques in North America. And that's just, frankly, an enormous amount of expertise that you really find concentrated in one organization. And as I'll get into later, the information asymmetries between the project participants and the market and the people setting the rules that are supposed to safeguard quality is one of the key reasons these markets have been so challenging over time. So I want to ask and answer two questions in this presentation. What is needed to align carbon offsets with the Paris Agreement? And what would it take to make those two things happen? And the short answer, just to cut straight to the point, is pretty much everything about the status quo has to change. And pretty much everybody has to want to make a change if those changes are going to be realistic. I'm pretty skeptical about that second point. We can talk about some of the interventions that are possible. Professor Pandy and others have shown how to do good work evaluating these programs and providing more evidence base for large interventions. And the problem is not that we don't know how to do it, it's that, from my perspective, most people don't want to do it for structural political reasons that I will get into. So what is needed to align carbon credits with the Paris Agreement? Broadly speaking, there's three issues with respect to carbon credits themselves. In the piece that I'll be talking about today, I give two additional reasons having to do with the nature of claims being made, which I'll leave out for the purposes of moving through this piece rather quickly. And the three things that you need to see from carbon credits is they need to be real and additional. They need to represent climate benefits that would not have otherwise happened without the climate project. I'll speak more about that. The other two things that need to happen is that the carbon credits need to reflect climate services that are based on carbon dioxide removal rather than avoiding or reducing emissions. So if we're going to align with the temperature stabilization goals of the Paris Agreement, we need to not just slow down the rate of emissions, but we actually need to counteract any remaining emissions with carbon dioxide removal. And the carbon dioxide removal needs to end up in a system that is managed with sufficient durability, or what's sometimes called permanence. The carbon needs to be stored out of the atmosphere for a very long period of time for that claim to be a valid claim. And I want to start with a picture from this piece that my colleagues and I published in One Earth, where we tried to categorize the global voluntary carbon markets using a remarkable database that my colleague Barbara Haya at UC Berkeley's published. And we categorized the market into these different categories you see here. The largest segment of the voluntary carbon market occurs in the forestry sector. The second largest is in renewable energy. And the color scheme we've used in the figure is meant to indicate the different climate services that are offered by projects across these different categories. Far and away, the dominant type of activity outside the forestry sector is avoided emissions, where projects are saying, I was going to do something that was high emitting, but if you pay me, I will do something that's lower emitting. In contrast, only a very small segment of the forestry credits come from activities that are dedicated to carbon removal, and that's the slightly darker purple shade at the end of the forestry bar you see from reforestation and afforestation activities. These are activities that intentionally set out to draw more CO2 out of the atmosphere into plant tissue. And the majority of what goes on in the forest world is a mixture of primarily avoided emissions with a little bit of carbon removal. So for example, in a tropical RED project where you might be protecting an area of tropical forest that's potentially at risk of being cut down, most of the carbon credits are awarded for the forest not being cut down, which is a form of avoided emissions, and a minority of those credits typically reflect the continued growth of that ecosystem, which reflects carbon dioxide removal. And the key point here is that today the status quo is nearly all the carbon credits reflect avoided emissions, which is not the level of compensatory claim you want to see if you're aiming for temperature stabilization, because you cannot give permission to keep emitting a permanent pollutant, CO2, to the atmosphere on the basis that somebody else didn't emit as much as they might have. You have to actually counteract it with removals if your goal is to get to temperature stabilization, and essentially today's market doesn't do that at all. The other issue that becomes really critical from a physical climate science perspective is the durability of carbon storage. And what I've showing here is again from the same One Earth paper based on a really incredible set of insights from a Norwegian researcher called Mikko Kirschbaum. And this shows here what happens to the global temperature, average surface temperature, using a climate model. If you take the entire history of tropical forest carbon credits, the largest segment of the voluntary market, and you assume that that forest carbon stays put for 40 years, which is a pretty generous assumption based on the contracts that are made in that market segment. And if the carbon is re-released at the end of that 40 years, this figure is showing two different outcomes. One in which the carbon, this temporary carbon storage in forest, is used as a carbon offset. That's referred to as a compensation use, shown in the gray line. And then there's what's called a contribution use, where the same project and investments are made, but no permission is given to increase pollution or maintain pollution somewhere else. And the point is you get temporary benefits when you have temporary storage. So you can, in the contribution use case, temporarily lower temperatures so long as you're not giving permission to pollute. But if that carbon credit is used as an offset, which is what's shown in the gray line, you basically have a wash on temperature. There's no net effect on temperature until the temporarily stored carbon is re-released, and then you have a net increase in temperature. And so the key point here is if you are compensating for fossil CO2 emissions using temporary carbon storage, that inevitably leads to higher longer-term temperatures. If you do it without any sort of offsetting application, you make the same investment, you don't give permission to pollute, you can achieve temporary benefits. Those are meaningful, but potentially limited. And one key question you might want to ask if you're thinking about a non-offsetting application, which is basically how long do you need to store the carbon in order for that temporary carbon storage to make a difference in climate mitigation? I think this is one of the most overlooked issues in carbon markets right now, which is that we've all sort of treated temporary carbon storage as equivalent to permanent carbon storage, when in fact it's not. And furthermore, what I think is so challenging is if you're realistic about the state of the current trends of global decarbonization, we're not on track for temperature stabilization. We're not even close. And you can see from this paper that was published in Science last year that most of the business as usual scenarios that involve current policies or minor improvements to current policies don't show temperature stabilization by the end of the century. And that's a problem because that means that we essentially need to have the temporarily stored carbon last for a century or longer, which is typically quite a bit longer than the contract terms you see in the private market today. This is a list here drawn from my colleague Barbara Haya's work of improved forest management or temperate forestry projects that are out there. This is the longest duration I've ever seen in the markets. A 100-year commitment is an incredibly long commitment. I frankly don't think it's particularly credible. And you can imagine in the context of smallholder applications in lower income countries, that legal commitments of that nature are potentially even less credible than they might be, for example, in the US or Canada. There are a number of quality problems in the market separate from these physical effects that I've mentioned. Again, if you want to align with the Paris Agreement, you need to shift to carbon dioxide removal and you need to focus on the durability of carbon storage to make compensatory claims about offsetting CO2 emissions that are actually consistent with stabilizing global temperatures. But separately, you also need those projects to reflect accurately the climate benefits that are claimed. And basically, there's a whole literature that's reemerged in the last several years that's, in some respects, rediscovered and reshown how similar problems in older offsetting systems have been well documented in the past. There's a number of problems related to the baselines that projects use, that story about what they would have done if they didn't get paid. And there's pretty consistent evidence across all of the major segments in the voluntary market that on average, people tend to exaggerate those claims, whether they're doing that maliciously or in good faith. The evidence is pretty clear across the major market segments that that's occurring. There's also this critical problem in economics, we call this adverse selection, where once you set a default rule, the people who tend to perform better under that default rule will preferentially opt into the system. And so you have this critical problem. You see it in forests, you see it in renewable energy applications, where once you say, here's what allows you to qualify for a carbon offset, the people who are already doing that activity have an incentive to opt in, even though their benefits are non-additional. And the tests that are used in this market really do not do a good job of screening that out. Finally, there's overstated durability claims. As I mentioned, you see in many of these programs a sense that the carbon will last long enough, and the various technical claims that are made to provide insurance programs for those programs really don't hold up and are not based on any physical accounting of the actual risks of carbon loss and disturbance that you see, especially in those natural ecosystems in question. So can any of this be fixed? I'll wrap this up in the next couple of minutes. Just to be blunt, I think probably not is the answer. And I want to be clear that this is not because there aren't great ways to think about experimental design and program evaluation that could be effective at figuring out what activities work and which don't work. The problem, I think, is much more about the political economy of these markets. Some of the key barriers to change include the fact that higher quality carbon credits simply cost a lot more than the business as usual non-additional credits, which can be bought at under a US dollar per ton in bulk in today's markets. If you are talking about a shift to higher quality carbon dioxide removal credits with long durability, those cost a lot more than today's credits and easily 2 to 3 orders of magnitude price differential between the junk credits on offer today and the high quality applications that are beginning to come to market in that segment. And the problem is that so long as junk credits persist and are treated as equivalent to these higher quality credits, they compete unfairly. At the same time, you have companies which have been the source of most of the funding in these markets pulling back from their net zero targets, which they're not on track for in terms of their own domestic emissions, let alone compensating for those emissions by paying others outside of their value chain for carbon credits. You also have governments that are not on track for most of their climate, forestry, and biodiversity goals, so there is a paucity of public funding available as well. And the information asymmetry between the project proponents, the market participants who are claiming credit in these activities, and the standard setters, whether they're private or public, who are trying to set the rules to create high quality outcomes, that information asymmetry is persistent and extraordinarily difficult to manage. Meanwhile, if you look closely at what the current carbon offsets industry is doing in response to the last several years of renewed criticism around the quality of the actions in their markets, you see kind of the opposite of what you'd be looking for if you thought this market was trying to figure out how to move to a higher quality and more sustainable future. Industry standards, the leading private sector standard is called the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Markets, and it literally doesn't do anything about junk credits. It's trying to put a label on the credits it deems higher quality, but it has no explicit strategy for dealing with the junk credits that dominate today's market. You have major philanthropies pressuring private standard setting organizations, particularly the Science Based Targets Initiative, to silence their efforts to analyze the quality of these programs, to bury those efforts, and to make political decisions that prioritize politics over science. You have industry lobbyists who are lobbying governments to approve carbon offsets for official compliance purposes so that they can be marketed as government approved also in the voluntary markets. And whenever you have practices that research eventually determines is problematic, and you maybe don't want to continue, and occasionally you see market actors say, you know, that's enough of this market activity. We realize it may be non-additional. We realize it may be lower quality, so we're going to stop engaging in that activity. You'll see new market entrants come along and pick up those same activities. So it's been extremely difficult. In the interest of time, I'll just close by saying one of the ways you can address this problem is by stop making offsetting claims and start moving to contribution claims, where you simply say, I'm investing in these projects because they're worthwhile, but they don't zero out my emissions on my book. It has a lot of advantages in terms of being able to clearly market what's going on, but it's still not clear where the money will come from, which is a persistent challenge in all of these markets if you're looking to influence behavior change on the ground. And with that, I'll stop and I look forward to the conversation and to Professor Pandy's remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kalinwad. That was a very well enlightening presentation, and certainly yes, a difficult one as well for many of us trying to figure out if carbon credits can benefit smallholder farmers. I think it just shows how hard it is going to be unless there are drastic changes. And in the meanwhile, for all of our audience, we would request you to put in your questions in Q&A. I did have a question around, are you saying that the avoided emissions are not good enough at this point in 2024? And that's, is it more of a timing issue, or was it's something that would have been also true if you're having this talk 20 years ago? So is it just the volume of emissions we need to reduce?
It's a great question. And I think this is an issue that underlies a major turn. In some sense, we've always kind of known this about the CO2 problem, but the contemporary crystallization and understanding of carbon budgets, which underlies the Paris Agreement, the latest round of scientific consensus emerged in the late 2000s. And that's where essentially the physical climate science community asserted with confidence that there's a linear relationship between cumulative emissions and temperature outcomes. In other words, what matters is how much we emit in total, not when we emit it, nor the rates at which we emit it. And so the key challenge there is that it doesn't matter. Avoided emissions don't actually do anything to stabilize the climate. At best, when they're perfect, they create a wash where there's no net harm, but that doesn't actually mitigate the problem. And I think that's what's interesting is offsets, and we get into this a little bit in the piece. Offsets were designed around flexible reductions. If you're trying to reduce pollution 20, 30, 40, 50%, offsets shift where it happens, and that can potentially be a way to get there. If you're trying to get to net zero, which is what the climate science requires, avoided emissions simply don't contribute to that mission.
Yes, that's I think a very important insight. And before I move to, and please, others have more questions. I think put your questions in the chat and particularly introduce some of the work that the CGIAR has been doing in this one. I know some of our work around carbon farming that's happening in India, for example, by CIMET, by ICRISAT. So please go ahead and ask your questions in your Q&A. And before I hand over to Professor Pandey, we have one more Slido question. So please keep answer that question while we would have the results again at the end. So this is more of an open-ended question. I'm sure that Dr. Danny's talk has sparked a lot of thoughts. Actually, my head is buzzing with a lot of questions right now, so I am a bit off my prepared track of speech. But having said that, our question here on Slido is, what research question or topics will you propose to make carbon credits to work for smallholder producers? The answer could also be that they're at their current form, they're unlikely to, which is what we just heard. But keep answering, and we would be taking on some of these issues towards the end of our today's webinar. With that, I want to pass on to Professor Pandey for your presentation. And thank you. And Danny, please be online, and we'll come back with more questions at the end. Over to you, Professor Pandey. And yes.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a delight to be here, and I'm particularly happy to be following on after the very insightful presentation by Professor by Dr. Cullenwood. So just to check, can you see my screen?
Yes, we
Okay,
can
great.
see. Yes.
Okay,
You
great.
might want to put it in a presentation mode.
Yeah, I'll just do that. Okay. So what I want to do today was pick up on many of the themes that Dr. Cullenwood talked about, but perhaps use a lens of what we've been learning from a set of evaluations in, I'd say, in economics in general, to think about some improvements that can be made. So just to get us all on the same page, when we're talking about voluntary carbon offsets, I think perhaps the way most of us have seen it very often is when we're getting onto a flight or buying a flight, and you see this very tempting option that you can buy a carbon offset that is going to essentially make it fine for the environment in terms of saving as many emissions as your flight is costing. And as Dr. Cullenwood already mentioned, these are relatively cheaply priced. So it's a very attractive idea. And in some ways, perhaps the surprise is how come this market isn't larger, given how attractive this idea is that you can just buy your way out of the problem while not changing many of your activities. So let me start by just giving you some background of where this market came from, because I think it's useful in thinking about how we got here before we start thinking about how we fix the problem. So as many of you know, that under the 2013 Kyoto Agreement, there was an agreement that lower income countries can not just engage in emission reduction projects and then earn credits equivalent to this. This then formed the basis of this then in some ways built into the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement, where a set of countries agreed that they wanted to reduce carbon emissions by 2030. And building on the Kyoto Protocol, there was the idea that if a country exceeds these or future targets, it could sell these emission reductions to another country. However, to date, and we've seen these discussions happen most recently in the last COP, there's been no formal regulatory system that has been approved for this under Article 6. And so as a result, we have no international regulator, and we have rather a set of voluntary markets that have come up. Now, in theory, these markets could achieve the Paris targets if they were able to do two things. First, they needed to have accurate emissions reduction measurement, and you need to be able to not just set price based on how many carbon offsets are being produced at some price set by brokers or developers, but rather the market needs to take into account a cap on the total number of future emissions that will be allowed given this global target, and that should influence the market price. However, in practice, we're not seeing either of these issues happen. Instead, what we see this emergence of a large voluntary carbon offset market. And just to remind you, who are the players in this market? So we have buyers of carbon offsets. These are both often individuals, but very often they're going to be large buyers. So there'd be, for instance, airlines coming in or banks coming in that are seeking to reduce the emissions by buying it. in order to buy it, where do these emissions come from? So I know there's a lot of interest in this audience in thinking about kind of small agricultural producers. Well, we can think of them as entering by working through the developers. So especially if we think of Red Plus and we think of some of the developers in it, they're often bringing together agricultural farmers or other say citizens living around forests and agreeing, for instance, through payment for ecosystem services to not undertake an activity of, say, deforestation. These projects, once they're developed, the brokers in the market, South Pole, for instance, is a very well-known one, would be taking these projects and bundling them and selling them. Now, one of the issues that comes up is how do we know that these projects are, as Dr. Cullenworth said, additional, that we would not, that they're making sure that the activities would not occur without the payments being made. Well, that's often a combination of activities undertaken by the brokers, but also the registries, which are responsible for ensuring that there is some amount of transparency and that the same project is not sold many times over. So this is how the market stands right now. And as I think Dr. Cullenworth said, it's roughly around $2 billion right now. These markets are currently not regulated. So you have multiple registries certifying projects, have different types of certifications that have different types of measurements. Registries are paid for each credit that they certify. And in addition, how are we identifying the extent of additionality? This usually comes through verifiers or auditors. And one of the key problems in this market is that these verifiers or auditors are not paid independently by, say, the government, but rather by the same project developers who then rely on the results to earn resources. So you can see there's a direct conflict of interest here. Now, while the market is small, it has certainly boomed, and it's boomed on the basis of having a lot of different types of carbon credits emerge over time. But more recently, and this was the starting point for the piece I wrote that Dr. Mukherjee talked about, which is there was also a price crash. On the left-hand side, you see both a headline from a New Yorker piece talking about a set of projects in Africa that were not additional, but you also see just the crash in the stock prices of many of the brokers and developers in this market over time. And in fact, this has gone so far as to even affect often the buyers of credit. So Delta, for instance, has faced a lawsuit from concerned citizens talking about how their carbon neutrality may have been incorrectly claimed because the offsets they purchased were not appropriate. Now, what went wrong in this market? Why did we see the sudden crash? First, I think there was much more awareness about a feature that Dr. Cullenworth has already talked about, which is whether there was actually additionality. It appeared that in many cases, credits were being purchased from projects that were non-additional, leading to unabated emissions. And part of this problem comes from the fact that we see that there are significant incentive problems in those who are auditing and verifying, leading, as Dr. Cullenworth said, is often an exaggeration of the baseline. In addition, there are significant difficulties with measurement. A lot of the formulae used to create baselines and predict additionality are proprietary, so many of us can't actually see and evaluate them. And the formulae used are very varied. And typically, they fail to create what, as social scientists, we would think is a critical feature in order to ask whether a project is additional, is whether you have a credible counterfactual. Markets are not transparent, both in terms of payments to the intermediaries and the price paid. And there are multiple approaches to measuring both permanence and leakage in this setting. And as a result of this, what we've seen is the size of this market is well below its potential. And just to give you a sense, right now, it seems to be accounting for, even if you take the best estimates of how well it's working, roughly something like just 0.8% of greenhouse gas emissions, which is well below how much we think deforestation contributes to global emissions. We can also see, and I think this is for any economist, a classic sign that the market isn't working well, is that in theory, every carbon offset is supposed to be achieving the same goal, which is reducing emissions. And to the extent that 1 ton of carbon CO2 emissions reduced is similar in any setting, we should see a very similar price. Now, some of those differences could be coming from uncertainty about how long they would keep the carbon from being emitted. But it's still the case that the extent of variation we're seeing in the prices is very unlikely to be consistent with these projects achieving the same outcome. And just to summarize, as a result, what we are seeing is the demand overall is low, the prices are too low, and as a result, there's a lot of underinvestment in new technologies. And this is just constraining investments in deforestation prevention, reforestation, and carbon sequestration. So I'm going to take a slightly different view from Dr. Cullenward and being a little bit more optimistic about what we can do here. And let me say up front that one place where perhaps he and I have slightly different views is on the importance of permanence. The way I see the issue of emissions is that I think I completely agree with him that what we need to reduce the overall emissions. But I think reducing emissions today is much cheaper and buys us time in which time we can both identify other solutions. But it's also very similar to how we're thinking about compliance markets in other areas, where what we see is, for instance, in something like the EU ETS market, you're actually just reducing coal usage today. Now that coal is under the ground, it can come out tomorrow and be burnt, but we are seeing value to delaying it because in that period of delay, there may be good reason to believe that you can actually come up with other solutions. Carbon removal is likely to be more expensive than preventing emissions. And so I think preventing emissions is a critical part of an overall strategy that helps us get towards this overall reduced emissions. So with that, let me just talk very briefly, I think I have 5 minutes left, about where I think some of the potential solutions would come from. I'm going to talk briefly about 3 things. So first, I want to give you an example of how in the first best world, we could actually measure additionality. Now, this is not something that will happen all the time for every project, but you can imagine using kind of good counterfactuals over classes of projects to identify certain features that should be required by a class of project before it is certified for additionality. The second one, which I think is much more straightforward, is that there are ways that we can end the conflict of interest by simply requiring features of how the payment system for auditors and verifiers work. And then finally, I want to this is a bit of a blue sky idea, throw out some ways in which we could be learning from successful emissions compliance markets. So a colleague of mine, Seema Jayachandran, and some of her co-authors looked to undertake a field experiment in Uganda with the Nature Conservancy Organization to test for additionality. They did a field experiment where they randomly assigned some households to receive 70,000 Ugandan shillings annually in return for conserving their forests. And this was measured by using high quality satellite imagery. This gives you an example of how they basically took a set of plots and then divided them into treatment and control, and then found that basically payments worked. They reduced the amount of deforestation, so there's clear evidence of additionality, and they were also able to test for leakage. Now, you can see that while you're not going to be able to do an RCT every time you have a new project, this would give you, for instance, some benchmarks, for instance, on what the kind of payment for an ecosystem in Uganda should be in order for us to expect additionality. So if it's only, say, 10,000 Ugandan shillings, you should be very unsure about it. There are certainly issues to be resolved, but I think this is an area one could work on. Turning to the next area, which is the conflict of interest in certification. I worked with my colleagues in India, so that's a low state capacity setting, which I think is relevant for many of these issues. where there was a clear perception that the use of audits, in this case for just getting emissions reports, was corrupted. And so what we did is we again did a randomized control trial where where in the treatment group, we broke the status quo by, rather than having firms choose their auditors, there was a list of certified auditors from which they were assigned to firms randomly, and there was a fixed payment schedule. So you could not have price shopping going on there. And what we found is that both the amount of truthful reporting went up. And importantly, because the regulator was seen as credible, this also led to an improvement in outcomes. Now, finally, let me turn briefly in the last 2 minutes that I have to talk about how I think compliance markets can help with price setting. So this is just a graph which I like to show, which shows you sort of the carbon price that gets set by compliance markets, the EU ETS, compared to international carbon credits. And just looking at this, we can see that the ETS has done a much better job of setting a price, which, while not at the social cost of carbon, is certainly closer to it than what we are seeing in carbon credit markets. Now, why are compliance markets working? They're working because they are trading permits to pollute, and their demand of this is shaped by legally mandated penalties where you have emitters trading among each other. Because these are both the buyers and sellers are potential emitters, they're incentivized to monitor each other. And by treating both of them as emitters, you're going to remove this issue of permanence. What you're doing is you're actually asking, in this period, what can we do to avoid emissions? I think why we need markets rather than just relying on regulation also has to do with climate justice. A well-structured international voluntary carbon market can incentivize compliance, but also can be used to ensure that we give rich country firms global climate responsibilities. I'm not going to have time to get into exactly how this will work, but the way you should think about it is that a rich country firm is going to be able to buy more permits than, say, its emission levels required in order to subsidize, say, forestry efforts in lower-income countries. And credit providers, in turn, so this is where I think the small farmers come in. They will need to be part of project developments only if they have rigorous standards of what they do. So let me just conclude with saying that what do I think we need to do at this stage? I think one thing we could do is try to convene a set of voluntary market participants, including good buyers, who develop these high-quality projects and have incentives to keep the prices high. And then we should use that to structure an experimental market and see how it works. If it's successful, we can scale it up. If it doesn't, we can stop. But at this point, I think we have enough at stake that we need to be taking these kind of experimental approaches and evaluation and on the basis of kind of good economic theory, try to see if we can get such efforts to work. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Pandey, for another fascinating presentation. I think we got to somewhat contrasting view with Dr. Cullenworth saying that these markets have to be fundamentally restructured, while yours, if I understood it correctly, is that these need some work, but those need not be absolute fundamental changes, but rather how do we improve how they actually function through constant monitoring, evaluation, and the feedback system to improve. So I think that opens up a number of very, very interesting questions. But what I heard as an undertone for both of you is, at the end of the day, what we do require is absolute reduction in emissions. That's kind of it's something that is absolutely required to reach our climate goals. So with that, I wanted to open this up for Q&A, and if Dr. Collingwood would also switch on his video and yes. So I hope everybody can see all of us. Can you just spotlight all the speakers? Yes, please. Thank you. So there are a few questions in the Q&A, and please keep your questions coming. We have a question from my colleague Emil Jat, who works in India, in Hyderabad with ICRISAT, and they have been working quite a bit on carbon farming, as they call it. So his question uh, is given that we know about the limitations, still we would like smallholder farmers to benefit from climate action that they are doing. I mean, for us, one of our major things is that we, as I had said at the beginning, that we do want our smallholder farmers, our producers, to adopt low emission technologies, but who will pay for it? I think that's kind of the question that is always there, because the benefits are more societal than individual. And in some cases, some of these low emission technologies are still at that level where they are actually, even there would be an absolute or a relative yield losses, at least for some years, after production. So there needs to be some kind of compensation and funding. So his question is about, can other kind of things like nature credits, ecosystem payment for ecosystem services, which is beyond the Paris commitments, can something like that work? So, and I think with that, I'll take one more question from Emil, which is around what strategy would you suggest to fix carbon credits in smallholder systems? So kind of both. So maybe Danny, you can take the first one, and Rohini, the second one around, around things that's happening outside of the Paris Agreement.
Sure. And I think part of the challenge here is that when you say there's a funding gap, and there are funding gaps in many critical areas, and I won't pretend to be an expert in smallholder agricultural systems, but there are all of these barriers we know, particularly in low-income areas of the world, where international transfers, I agree with Professor Pandey, are going to be an important part of actually getting anything done. The question is whether or not mobilizing climate finance that is premised on the equivalence of the climate benefit that's claimed by those activities and an offsetting claim that's typically made by a buyer is actually functional for the atmosphere. And again, I continue to express skepticism about that functional equivalence while also appreciating the critical importance of the financial flows. So I think if I could identify maybe a difference in perspective between myself and Professor Pandey on this, it's not that we don't have tools for evaluating the efficacy of interventions. My argument is that the political economy of these programs has been really hostile to incorporating those lessons at large scale. I share the optimism that if you could find buyers, people who are willing to pay for outcomes, who want to understand the efficacy and want to get it right, that you could partner together and figure some of that out. But I would say left to their own devices, all of these programs tend to default to searching for the lowest cost. And when you have just a few dollars per ton as the credit price, you tend to have the most non-additionality risks. You tend to have the least successful interventions. You tend to have the least impactful interventions from the standpoint of actually changing what's happening on the ground for smallholders. So whatever form of financing you're seeking, if it's hard to make an equivalence claim, and I think it pretty much is when it comes to the agricultural sector, um, I think it's a poor fit for the climate, but that doesn't mean if you could find the right people on the buyer side that you couldn't figure out something worthwhile. And I want to emphasize that means finding the right buyers, which is, again, not what these markets tend to produce. So that's my quick thoughts. Looking forward to others.
Yeah, so if I could briefly jump in, I think one thing that we want to do is we want to think not in terms of offsets, but rather moving towards targets. And so you want to move towards, say, the Paris Agreement target or other targets. I think using the words of offsets is misleading, because it seems to suggest that what you're doing is business as usual and just offsetting. And there I think I would completely agree with Dr. Cullenworth that we need to be thinking about moving towards this target. Now, where I think what you could be doing when we think about small farmers, and that's certainly something I've seen in my work, is there is a tendency to set prices too low, right? So I think at the basic level, one of the issues is we need to get people to do activities that are going to involve some income loss. And that income loss needs to be compensated through these payments. So one of the kind of thing I think evaluations can do very well is give some benchmarks of when are payments too low. And then I think what we need some set of registries or certifiers to say that they would not certify projects that are making payments, say in the case of payment for ecosystems, that go below that point, because we know that if you're going to reduce someone's desire to deforest and farm on the land, that's too low a payment. Where I think, and then I think the next point where I think what we're saying is that you certainly are not going to start by saying you're going to take the big project developers or the big brokers right now and convince them of this. And so that's why I'm saying that I think what you want to do is you want to start by creating on a voluntary basis a set of kind of good buyers who are committed to this goal. And I believe they do exist, often pushed very hard by their shareholders and projects that are willing to live by that kind of certification. So I think what in terms of CGIAR and sort of thinking about small farmers, you want to think about who are the groups that are going to be willing to enter and say, we will commit to making payments that don't go below X level. And I think once you have some of the proof of concept, we can hopefully start having a slightly different conversation. That's not a mark that this is going to succeed. But I think, as I said, I think right now we need to be trying everything. And this seems to be something that's worth trying to understand how far we can get with it. And then see whether, in the ideal case, you crowd out bad projects from the market. That may not happen. I agree with Dr. Cullen, there may be a lot of people. But I think we can create spaces where this happens. I think certainly we see that, I think just in the whole scope of, for instance, the quality of PES systems, emissions tradings, seeing the good ones and the bad ones. So we need to kind of identify ways of having some kind of ring fencing of good buyers and good suppliers and try to show what that market would look like, even if it's on small scale to start with.
Yeah, those are we have several other questions in the Q&A, and I'm conscious of the time. So we have a question from Praharsh Patel. He's asking more around the behavioral side, the very fact that you can offset, and I think Professor Pandey have kind of answered a little bit. The very fact that there is this concept that you can offset your high consumption lifestyle through doing some plantation somewhere else. Does it fail to convey the message that you have to actually reduce emissions rather than continuing with your business of usual lifestyles? I think that is more of that's a question that Praharsh is asking. How do we actually communicate the fact that we need absolute emission reduction?
I think we have to move away from language like offsets. I think offsets is a very misleading language.
Right.
I think that's right. And the only counter argument I'll offer, because I agree completely, we should be moving away from that and looking to these net reductions. But almost all of the applications in the industry today are offsetting applications. And I'm struck once you move into this question of net reductions and targets, a lot of this becomes simpler. When you're in a compensatory offsetting mode, you must achieve perfection to have no net harm to the atmosphere. And that's very difficult to achieve in the real world. Once you move away from that, things get a lot easier and there's more opportunity for the experimentalism that Professor Pandey articulated, which I think is great. And the challenge you hear on the market side when you make that argument is, well, who's going to want to pay for that? And I think that's ultimately the big question we're all asking. Because if you can find some buyers who are willing to experiment with a better model, I think you can try some things out. But at the end of the day, most people in this industry think that they're going to sell the right to pollute, even though most of the academics and scholars who work on this think the program design needs to reorient towards something else, exactly as Professor Pandey has outlined. So that's a key tension. I share the questioner's concerns about how it's currently being done and hope if we can move to a different model, we'll avoid some of those concerns.
We have one more question around emission avoidance versus carbon removal potential. Given that for a smallholder producer who works on croplands, actually the potential of carbon dioxide removal is almost non-existent or very small. So potential avoidance of emissions still remains important. Are there any ways of monetizing that? Would the voluntary carbon market work for any of those potential emission avoidance?
That's how most of the market works today. And the point I was making about saying we need to stop that, just to integrate the discussion we just had, you cannot do carbon offsets based on avoided emissions and have that be consistent with temperature stabilization. You can pay for producing the emission reduction services like those a smallholder might produce, so long as those payments aren't connected to ongoing permission to pollute. So I'm not suggesting it isn't important. It's most important to get emissions as close to zero as possible. And I recognize, particularly with smallholders, how difficult that is without external financing. The problem is that the current industry model is premised on selling the right to pollute. Once you break that, this becomes, I think, a much more attractive option. But the problem is, where does the money come from? And that's, again, what we keep returning to in all of these debates, is the view that the money will come from people who are emitting, high-income emitters who are willing to pay others to maintain the status quo. And we all know that doesn't work. But that is currently the financial engine of this enterprise we've been discussing. It need not be the only way this is operated, but it's the dominant way it operates today.
That's right. And I think what you want to experiment with is that when you move to this, say, other model where you're actually focused on targets, not on offsets, as I said, what you're going to have is you're going to have a set of, say, rich country emitters who, say, airline industry, who can't actually function without emitting, who are going to recognize that it's not that they're going to have to buy as many permits as they're emitting. They're actually going to have to buy many more permits than what they're emitting. And that's the transfer that should be made to lower income countries, to say to PS programs or small agricultural farmers, to then engage in activities that reduces carbon. So I think that at some level, what's key is that what we're moving towards is limits placed on us by the Paris targets. And that's going to imply that it's not just saying that I have to pay for 50. You might well be in a case where you actually are going to have to take buy a lot more permits, because that's the only thing that's sustainable with getting towards that target.
Right. So somebody has to go out there and set those standards and say that instead of so many tons, you have to compensate for so many extra ones.
That's right. So we need some kind of regulator in this market. I think that's one of the things that we are failing to have right now, and the registries are not going to play that role.
Right. So I think, okay, we have one more question. Countries like India launching their own voluntary carbon markets. What do you think about this, and what suggestions or lessons from the current voluntary markets would you recommend for consideration?
So I think in India, the way right now they're thinking about the carbon markets, first of all, I think it's great that they're having this discussion. For a long time, India was not willing to have a discussion of carbon caps. My concern, right, and I think the way they sort of have right now, they have two different things. They're talking about having a carbon market, say, building on what they had already with the BEA. And then separately, there's a lot of discussion about how small farmers can enter for green credit. But again, I think what has not been recognized right now is that you're going to need a regulator who's going to be actually stating how much, say, firms have to buy. Otherwise, we run the same danger of the price being way too low. And I think that was something that we've seen happen, for instance, in the REC market in India already. So I think right now carbon is not priced. It's not like kind of particulate matter emissions where there is penalties. And so I think what's going to be important if this market is going to function is to be able to think of regulator who's actually going to, put penalties on firms that are not, kind of trying to reach the target, and what that means in terms of how much credit they'd have to buy and what price that would be. I think that's a discussion that needs to be introduced, but isn't right now ongoing.
Right.
I would add to that very briefly that Professor Pandey made a really good comment about the non-independence of the verifiers in all of these systems, and I agree with that completely. I think there's an additional problem here, which is that the standards for how you calculate the putative climate benefits are actually what are often quite weak, and all the verifiers are doing are checking to see whether or not projects have complied with those standards, rather than whether those standards produce the climate benefits they claim. And so when we think about any market, including a new market in India being set up, there's a question about whether or not the regulator will be able to interact and engage in critical dialogue around those issues. And I can't point to a government-run system that's done an effective job with that. The best job I've seen is when the Europeans decided to stop buying clean development mechanism carbon credits entirely because they simply were so low quality and just weren't being reformed. So the challenge I just wanted to introduce here is the standards for measurement and what a project has to demonstrate is where the quality concerns manifest, and nobody's really monitoring and uptaking information about the performance of those systems particularly well. And for any public or private actor to do this well, they need to demonstrate their capacity to recognize when there are shortcomings and make improvements over time, which is shockingly rare in this industry.
So would then one of the research areas that we should be looking at is how is to value the carbon appropriately so that it meets some of these Paris aligned targets? Is that?
Potentially, but again, even just to calculate how many carbon credits should a particular project get, that's set by the methodological rules, which are often quite weak for the reasons we've talked about. And so the point I'm trying to make is if you want these systems to get better over time, the regulator, whether that's a public government regulator or a private standard setting body, needs to track and update its rules, not simply reject all criticism, which has generally been the approach most public and private regulators have taken in this industry.
Okay. So that was, I think, we are at the dot at the hour and about to close our webinar. I want to thank our speakers once again. This was a fantastic discussion, and we had a lot of ideas that came through from our Slido poll. If my colleague would just quickly open the last question. I do not think I have time to summarize all of them, but we would share this with B. So we had a number of questions, like if you can just keep going down. I saw something about how long are so this Sifori craft one I thought was very interesting. Can you just go down a little bit so that we can see? And the question around how long will our smallholder producers be expected to be custodians of our nature without being compensated for it? So those are some of the issues that I think we need to keep thinking about and design our work around it. At the end of the day, what it looks like is the systems that we have in place are not yet quite there that might work for a smallholder farmer. And perhaps we have to think of other means of financing their decarbonization journey. It will not necessarily come from voluntary carbon markets. And perhaps we might have to look at other avenues of climate finance. It's not as if all of us know that it's not as if there's a lack of actual finance in the system. How that gets utilized and what that gets prioritized is literally the trillion-dollar question. So with that, thank you so much. And we will be sharing the recording and all the slides with all of you, and join us for our next month's episode, which would be mostly around carbon dioxide removal, because every scenario of IPCC that takes us to Paris agreed goals of 1.5 to 2 actually involves substantial amount of carbon dioxide removal, and our technologies are nowhere near ready for the kind of volumes that we are expected to remove from the atmosphere. So that will be our next topic in the next month. So thank you.